Why is it that when everyone is making plans, you only feel relief? Why does going out exhaust you instead of exciting you? Why do you prefer the silence of your home to the constant noise of the world? And even more importantly, what if it isn't shyness or being antisocial, but a different way of processing life? Today, we are going to discover what really happens in the minds of those who love staying at home. Stay until the end. There is something that happens when everyone around you is making plans for the weekend and you feel absolutely nothing. No fear of missing out, no regret, just a quiet, almost guilty relief because you don't have to go anywhere. You see stories of packed bars, impromptu trips, massive concerts, and the only thing you think is that it sounds exhausting. If you recognize yourself in this, you aren't broken. You aren't missing any essential piece of the human experience. You are simply wired differently. That feeling of canceling a plan at the last minute and noticing how your whole body relaxes as if your nervous system could finally stop pretending is no coincidence. Nor is the fact that you've been called boring or antisocial just because you prefer to stay home rather than attend a party where you don't know anyone. Maybe your perfect Friday doesn't include noise or crowds, but rather comfortable clothes, your favorite show, and zero small talk. And what for others is isolation, for you is real rest. Over time, you have built a life where home is not just a physical place. It is your point of balance, your safe zone, the only space where you don't need to perform. However, society insists on treating this as a problem, as if you needed to be fixed, as if loving tranquility were a character flaw. But what psychology describes is not avoidance or disguised social anxiety. It is a legitimate orientation toward internal presence, a preference for restorative solitude, the kind that doesn't drain you, but recharges you. People who love staying at home aren't running away from life. They are looking for peace in a world that glorifies hyperconnectivity and constant movement. And choosing peace nowadays is almost a radical act. Now the question is inevitable. Where does this way of being come from? To understand it, we have to go back to the beginning. None of this starts in adulthood. It doesn't suddenly appear when you decide to decline an invitation or when you realize you prefer a Saturday at home over a social gathering. The root is usually much further back in the first years of life. Many people who love staying at home today were deeply observant children. They weren't necessarily the loudest in the group or the ones constantly seeking attention. They were the ones who analyzed the environment before entering, those who needed time to adapt, those who perceived emotional nuances that others overlooked. From a young age, their nervous system reacted with greater intensity to external stimuli. Here, a key concept enters: high sensitivity. It's not about fragility, but about a greater capacity to process sensory and emotional information. Bright lights, loud noises, arguments, unexpected changes, everything is registered more deeply. And when the brain processes more, it also fatigues sooner. During childhood, this might have been interpreted as shyness. Perhaps you heard phrases like, get out more, don't be so quiet, you need to get with it. However, what was happening was something else. Your brain was absorbing much more than others could imagine. Every social interaction involved constant analysis. Every conversation meant interpreting gestures, tones, and silences. With time, this continuous processing generates a natural preference for predictable environments. Home offers something that the outside world rarely guarantees: control. Control over noise, over lighting, over the rhythm. And when you have a nervous system that is easily activated, that control becomes a need for regulation, not a whim. Furthermore, many people with this tendency develop a rich inner life, imagination, deep thought, a capacity for introspection. While others seek external stimulation, you find enough content within yourself. You don't need constant social validation because your internal world is already complex and meaningful. What for some is loneliness, for you is mental space. What others call isolation, for you is balance. And this configuration is not a flaw that should be corrected, but a trait that, when understood well, can become an extraordinary strength. But this isn't the only piece of the puzzle. There are specific patterns that define those who find their energy at home, and understanding them completely changes the perspective. The first pattern is the need for recovery after social interaction. It doesn't matter if the experience was positive. Even a pleasant gathering can leave a feeling of exhaustion. It isn't a rejection of people. It is mental saturation. Your brain has been processing expressions, tones, expectations, and social dynamics without rest. When you return home, what you feel isn't sadness. It is physiological relief. The second pattern is the preference for deep relationships over superficial connections. Trivial conversations drain you more than silence. You find no meaning in talking just for the sake of talking. You need content, meaning, a real exchange. And when that isn't there, your energy drops rapidly. The third pattern is emotional hyperawareness. You perceive subtle changes in the environment. You notice tensions before they are expressed in words. This can be an extraordinary skill, but it also carries a constant burden. Being in large groups means receiving multiple emotional signals at the same time. That overload explains why home feels like a sanctuary. The fourth pattern is internal self-stimulation. You don't depend on the outside for entertainment. You can spend hours reading, watching a show, learning something new, or simply thinking. Your mind generates enough activity that you don't need constant external movement. The fifth pattern is the search for control over the environment. At home, you decide the volume, the temperature, the pace. Outside, the world is unpredictable. For someone with high sensory reactivity, that unpredictability involves a considerable energy expenditure. The sixth pattern is social selectivity. It isn't about avoiding people, but about choosing carefully. You prefer few but solid bonds. The idea of constantly expanding your social circle isn't attractive to you. Depth is worth more than quantity. The seventh pattern is the distorted perception by the environment. For years, you might have been made to feel that you should change. That loving tranquility was a problem. That social pressure generates internal conflict. You wonder if you should be different. However, when you accept yourself, you discover that your way of living is not inferior, just different. These patterns don't appear by chance, nor are they the product of a trend. They are related to how your nervous system works, and to understand it better, we need to look at what happens in the brain. From a neurological point of view, people who prefer to stay home aren't avoiding social life out of simple attitude. Their brain functions with a different intensity. Various studies show that individuals with higher sensitivity present deeper activation in areas related to emotional and sensory processing. This means that every stimulus is analyzed in greater detail. While some people need high levels of stimulation to feel active, others reach that point much sooner. It is a matter of threshold. When that threshold is exceeded, the nervous system enters a state of overload. Mental fatigue, irritability, or an urgent need to withdraw appears. Additionally, the brains of those who enjoy solitude tend to strongly activate networks associated with internal reflection, deep thought, imagination, and autobiographical memory. Being alone does not imply emptiness, but rich and constant internal activity. That is why silence is not experienced as absence, but as a productive space. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter related to reward, also plays a role. Some people get a greater reward in intense social contexts. Others experience it in individual activities such as reading, creating, or simply thinking. It isn't that one way is superior to the other. They are different motivational configurations. Understanding this completely changes the narrative. It's not about a lack of social skills or an inability to connect. It is about energy management, about recognizing which environments expand your well-being and which ones reduce it. But understanding the mechanism isn't enough. The final question is how to live in balance in a world that constantly pushes for exposure and noise. Living with this configuration doesn't mean locking yourself away or rejecting all interaction. It means recognizing your energy limits and respecting them. Balance begins when you stop forcing yourself to meet external expectations that are not aligned with your nature. A fundamental tool is planning for social rest. If you know an event will demand energy, set aside time afterward to recover, not as a reward but as a physiological necessity. It is also key to communicate your limits without guilt. Saying you prefer small gatherings or quiet plans is not a weakness. It is self-knowledge. Another strategy is differentiating between isolation and chosen solitude. The first is born of fear, the second of regulation. When you consciously choose to stay home because it brings you calm, you aren't running away. You are taking care of yourself. And perhaps most importantly is changing the internal dialogue. You aren't less interesting because you don't constantly seek external stimuli. You aren't antisocial for valuing silence. Your way of relating to the world is more introspective, more deliberate, but no less valid. In an environment that glorifies continuous exposure, choosing tranquility is an act of personal coherence. You don't need to become someone louder to fit in. You just need to understand how you function. Loving staying home is not a flaw that should be corrected. It is an expression of how your mind finds balance in the midst of chaos. End of script.